The first item of backbench business, it is the intention to run each of these debates for just an hour and a half, given the time we are left with. So, motion on seizing frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine. Mike Martin to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would like to thank the Backbench Business Committee and colleagues from across the House for coming together to debate this important motion. Madam Deputy Speaker, Sasha is 12 and he's from Mariupol. He was cooking outside with his mother. Their apartment had been bombed and they were shelled. And some shrapnel went into Sasha's eye, imperiling his eyesight. Luckily, they managed to get to a first aid station where the shrapnel was removed and thankfully his eyesight was saved. Shortly after, they were captured by Russian forces and taken to a filtration camp. And there they were separated. You go over there, and you go over there. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have echoes of this in our European history. They weren't even allowed to say goodbye. Sasha was then taken to a further location in occupied Ukraine and was told that his mother didn't want him anymore and that he would be sent to live with a Russian family, a good Russian family. Now, Sasha is braver, cleverer and more tenacious than I. He managed to get hold of a mobile phone and he rang his grandmother, told his grandmother where he was, and then through an extraordinary series of events and organisations, his grandmother managed to get him out of that situation. He now lives with his grandmother. Sasha doesn't know if his mum is dead or alive, and he's still looking for her. Extraordinarily, Sasha is one of the lucky ones. He escaped his abduction. He escaped his Russification, his indoctrination, and he escaped being severed forever from his birth family and adopted is the term that is used, with a Russian family. We can't say the same for 19,000, at least, other Ukrainian children. 19,000 children, actual, verified, documented cases by the Ukrainian government of Ukrainian children who have been taken from Ukraine and placed with Russian families, told to forget Ukraine and told to love Russia. Now, this is actually one of the smaller estimates. The UN thinks that there are 120,000 Ukrainian children that have been abducted and sent to Russia. And extraordinarily, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I have experienced war, so I think I have a good handle on the full range of human behaviour. But extraordinarily, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are Russian officials who are boasting about the numbers of Ukrainian children they have abducted and placed with Russian families. Some figures range from 300,000 and some of them range up to 700,000. Crimes like this do not go unnoticed. In 2023, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and for Maria Malova-Belova, who, in possibly the most Orwellian job title, is the Russian Federation's Children's Rights Commissioner. Arrest warrants were issued for these two for the war crime of unlawfully abducting, deporting and transferring of children from Ukraine to Russia. And worse, Madam Deputy Speaker, this crime actually amounts to genocide. The abduction of children and their indoctrination into another culture is considered genocide. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are echoes here of Europe's past. Yeah. Never again, they said. Never again. I will give way to the Chair of Defence.
I thank my honourable friend and congratulate him on securing today's important debate, because it's been nearly 3 years since Putin tried to illegally invade the whole of Ukraine, leading to devastating loss of life, displacement and destruction. We must, of course, ensure that Ukraine has all the support it needs, but surely it shouldn't just be my Slough constituents and the UK taxpayers contributing. So does my honourable friend agree that in order to ensure that, given that Russia and Putin are no longer listening to the international community and they show no sign of stopping, does he now feel that the time is right that our government should be using those frozen Russian assets to ensure that Putin pays directly for the damage that he is inflicting upon the Ukrainian people?
I would like to thank the Chair of the Defence Select Committee, under whose stewardship I have the honour of serving on the Defence Committee. And he is, of course, right, and that is why we have come here today. And as I make progress in my speech, I will set out some of the arguments, but he is, of course, right. So this question of never again leaves us a moral question, of course. How do we answer the genocidal abduction of children on European soil? It also leaves us a strategic question, and it is to that to which I will now turn. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will give way.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for securing this debate and the wonderful way that he's started his speech. I think it's important for us to recognise the abduction of children from Ukraine, from Crimea and the Donbass didn't start in 2022, but it started in 2014. So it's been going on 11 years now, and the figures that he gives are, well, broadly correct from meetings I've had with Crimea Platform and others in Ukraine. But he made allusions to the Second World War. The Second World War only lasted 6 years. The camps only existed 3 years, and we're 11 years into this child abduction. The international law, humanitarian law, effectively started in Nuremberg. Does he agree with me that we need to have a much longer and deeper look at this post the Ukraine war in terms of international law and resetting it?
I thank the honourable member for Leeds Central. I do indeed agree. This is a war crime of stupendous scale, breadth and width. And it is, of course, not just a question of justice, but it's also a question of getting those children back to their families in Ukraine. And that is part of the work that we all must do once this war is over, with Russia defeated and Ukraine victorious.
Would the Honourable Gentleman give way?
I will give way.
Can I commend the Honourable Gentleman for Tunbridge Wells for bringing this forward? I was happy to be a signature to the request of the Backbench Committee to ask for this as well. But does he agree with me that the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine since the start of the war has been escalated, with thousands injured and killed, with millions fleeing for better lives elsewhere, some of them in my constituency of Strangford, some 300 families working and living in Strangford, shortages of medical supplies, hospitals overwhelmed, and an energy food crisis? And does he agree, and I think the thrust of this debate is, frozen Russian assets doesn't work, they have to be seized?
I thank the honourable member for Strangford. I quite agree, and in Tunbridge Wells I've been heartened by the number of families that have taken in Ukrainian refugees, and we have a Ukrainian school to continue the important work of enshrining and protecting Ukrainian culture, because this is one of the things you do when you commit genocide. You destroy the culture of your enemy. So, moving on to the strategic questions. Madam Deputy Speaker, I cannot state plainly enough that Ukraine is fighting for us. Ukraine is fighting for the United Kingdom, and Ukraine is fighting for the security of Europe. Putin will not stop if he succeeds in Ukraine. He seeks to recreate a Russian empire, or at least a sphere of influence, the territory of which is currently covered by countries that wish to remain free, and countries, I hasten to add, that are allies with us by treaty. I speak of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland. And it is important, of course, that we look to the future, in only 2 weeks now, election of President-elect Trump. We don't know how he will respond. We don't know what he will do. He may not know himself what he is going to do. But we do know that he feels differently about Ukraine, he feels differently about the security of Europe, and he feels differently about Russia. Now, why is that important? Well, we, the United Kingdom, should be proud of the leadership role that we have played over Ukraine. From the first NLAWs to the £3 billion and then some that we give every year. And we have worked with allies throughout. In total, $380 billion of support, security, humanitarian and financial, have been given to Ukraine. Of that, $180 billion has come from the US. So we can see immediately that the US, as so often in international affairs, is totally indispensable. The security of Europe rests upon American support. And so if that support is withdrawn, we have a problem. Luckily for us, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have options. When the renewed invasion in February 22 was inflicted upon Ukraine, we moved swiftly with allies to freeze Russian assets. There are some $300 billion of Russian state assets in G7 countries. Some $200 billion of those assets are in Euroclear in Belgium. And there are probably more than £20 billion worth of assets in the United Kingdom. The Minister will have a better idea than me, and perhaps he can undertake to update the House when he speaks later as to exactly the scale of the Russian assets that are currently held in UK institutions. And in June last year, the G7 agreed that we were going to use the interest from those assets to support Ukraine. And this House passed the enabling legislation cross-party just before Christmas. And so this amounts to about £50 billion that we are going to support Ukraine with. And this is a very welcome first step.
Will the honourable friend give way?
Of course.
Does my honourable friend agree with me that the UK, working shoulder to shoulder with our European allies, must lead the way in confiscating and repurposing frozen Russian assets for Ukraine, and by ensuring Ukraine has every financial and military resource it needs, we can not only help them reclaim their own country, but also send a powerful message that Britain stands unwavering in defence of freedom and democracy against Russian aggression.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. She is, of course, right. It is not just about actions that lead to practical outcomes. It is also about signals that we send to our geopolitical opponents.
When you give way? I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. I'm listening very carefully to what he has to say, and I agree with much of it, including that Russia must pay for what it has done in terms of supporting Ukraine in its war and the reconstruction to come, whatever that looks like. However, does he share my concern that were we to act unilaterally, or indeed with others, we may encourage the attractiveness of other reserve currencies and systems, in particular China's, and that capital, among them, the 12 trillion or so globally invested, may find its way to Beijing rather than safer destinations, currently safer destinations in the Western world?
I thank him for his intervention, and I can answer him directly. I'm not advocating that we should move unilaterally. I do not think that would be a good idea. If one country were to move, then of course that does allow capital flight to other G7 countries. But he does mention China, and the problem with the Chinese currency is it's not fully convertible. And so it is not an international currency that people like to keep lots of their reserves in. And this is why I'm advocating that the G7 as a whole should move. And if you look at the currencies of the G7, the dollar, sterling, of course, euro, $200 billion of these assets are denominated in euros, yen. These are the major reserve currencies of the world. And so if those countries move together, then I think we will be safe. And I think the broader point that he's making is about financial stability on international markets. And I think this is an important point. But I would say that any potential small amount of financial instability that the G7 countries moving together will create will be minuscule as compared to the financial instability of Ukraine losing this war. So if we want to shift the dial on Ukraine, especially in the face of a drawdown or potential drawdown in US support, we need to go further and faster, and we need to seize these $300 billion of frozen assets and send them to Ukraine. And Madam Deputy Speaker, there is a clear legal pathway for doing so. The international law doctrine of state countermeasures says that states are able to take countermeasures against other states if there have been grievous violations of international law, like genocidal abduction of children. I will, of course.
Thank you for giving way. I heard the question from the member opposite in relation to coordinated action on this matter. And whilst no G7 nation has yet moved fully to seize Russian state assets, both Canada and the US have enacted legislation permitting this. So I wonder if the honourable member would agree with me that actually legislation on this matter is an important step forward, and that the threat of immediately seizing $300 billion of immobilised assets is a tool that would add pressure to Russia's already waning economy.
Thank you very much. It's as if I gave her a copy of my speech, because it was the very next paragraph that I was going to come to. And indeed, the US in April of 2024 passed the Repo Act, which was the enabling legislation to enable the US to seize frozen Russian assets and to give them to Ukraine for her defence, indeed for our defence. And what is more, it became clear over the last month that the US has been quietly pushing its G7 allies, one assumes us as well, to take this step to investigate and to seek how to seize these assets and to send them to Ukraine. And so perhaps the Minister as well, in his comments later, would feed back to the House what conversations have been had with the US State Department, what they've asked us to do, and how we have responded.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will, thank you.
Thank you very much for giving way. As he asked a question to the Minister, I'll highlight this, that I hope this government has a better record than the previous government at seizing these assets. Sutton Place in my constituency of Woking was suggested by the former Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab that should be sold to benefit Ukraine or house Ukrainian refugees, and it is sitting idle despite the fact it has been sanctioned as it's an Usmanov ownership. I would hope, and I hope my honourable friend would agree with me, that this new government needs to do much better and sell assets like Sutton Place to benefit Ukraine.
Interventions have been far too long, and I did point out at the beginning of the debate there are only going to be 90 minutes allowed for it. Perhaps the member in charge might consider concluding his remarks shortly. Mike Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am coming to a conclusion. And so What we ask in this motion is very simple. It is not to seize the assets, although we think the time for that has come. It's not to act unilaterally, as my colleague on the Conservative benches asked a question about, but it is indeed to investigate with allies how we can go about seizing these assets legally, and then to report back to the House on those findings. And if the government does indeed agree with us that they will do that, perhaps they could let us know in their remarks, perhaps the Minister could let us know in his remarks, the timelines for that. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to conclude by saying this. This is an issue of unity. We have been united. This House has been united, and this country has been united in our support for Ukraine and in our opposition to Russia's aggression. And in the spirit of that unity, we have shown in this House on Ukraine and on Russia what we are doing is humbly beseeching the government to investigate with allies how they can go about seizing these assets legally. We've remained united throughout on Ukraine, and we have shown exceptional leadership. And now is the time to show that leadership again.
The question is, as on the order paper, there will be an immediate 5-minute time limit. Blair McDougall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate the member for Tunbridge Wells for securing the debate. And there's a bit of a disease in British politics of reaching back to the Second World War to make a point. But when we walk into this chamber, we walk through an archway of bomb damage. And I think when we hear the echoes of history, we should listen to them. And I think he made that point eloquently. In a sense, it's frustrating, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we even are debating whether to do this or not today. But it is good that we're having this debate because that we care about the rule of law and the international order is what separates us from Putin and his allies. But we do have to prove to Putin and his allies that our belief in those things are not a weakness. We do have to prove that we have the determination to defend our values. And in this year, which does mark the 80th anniversary of the defeat of fascist aggression in Europe, we have to constantly remember that the freedoms we enjoy were won through strength and through sacrifice, that freedom comes at a cost. And the member for Tunbridge Wells listed the enormous price that Ukraine is now paying in lost citizens and lost children and lost infrastructure for defending that freedom. Well, the world has said clearly that Putin has to pay the price for that. The UN General Assembly has said that they must make reparation for the injury, including for damage made by their acts. And this is a debate about balance sheets and bank accounts. But putting a monetary value on the cost of this war is at best partial accounting. Yes, Sam.
Thank you to the Honourable Member for giving way. Would the Honourable Member agree with me that for too long Vladimir Putin's allies saw Britain as a soft touch and a good place to put their money and investment, whether under ill-gotten gains or legally? And is it now not time under a new government for us to show that this has changed? This government will take it very seriously, and we will take a more rigorous approach than the previous government.
Absolutely. As well as listening to the echoes of deeper history, we have to learn lessons from more recent failures that we've made. But I met a soldier in a ward for wounded soldiers in Kyiv called Dmitry. He was strengthening his stumps for the day that he could have prosthetics fitted to both of his now missing legs. And I asked him what was his hope for the future, thinking he would say that it was a holiday or getting a job or spending time with his family. And he said that it was living life without shame. And listening to him, I felt ashamed because as proud as we all are of the support we've given, it hasn't been enough and it hasn't delivered the support that Ukraine needs. We know one thing in this debate, and it is that the money that Putin owes is greater than the money that has been seized, many times greater of it. And the legal objection to transferring those funds in whole to Ukraine seems to be that under the principles of the use of countermeasures by states, that the measures must first induce a change in policy from the target and second be irreversible. Well, on the first, seizing the assets doesn't just induce the change in policy, it delivers the change in policy. It pays those reparations in part. And on it being reversible, we can give the Kremlin a credit note for the money paid and tell them it's been taken off of the total. With the time I've got left, I want to ask the Minister 2 direct questions. It's really a question, though, to all Western nations who hold Russian state assets but are hesitant about sending them in full to Ukraine. The first is there any conceivable situation where we and our international partners would unfreeze these assets that we hold and return them to Russia if Putin has not delivered the reparations he's bound to pay? And second question is there any situation we can conceive of where Putin would voluntarily give up those reparations? I think if we're honest, the answer to both of those questions has to be no. So rather than making policy on an imaginary future that won't come and holding these funds in perpetuity, we should use them now in full, in whole, when Ukraine needs them most. And if we are hung up in those legal arguments, as I say, call it a loan, give the Kremlin a credit note, and let's do that. Madam Deputy Speaker, the irony of this debate is we are at risk of having our own commitment to the international order preventing us from enforcing it. And the irony is that Putin, having stepped outside that international order, is demanding the protection of it. We need to listen to the echoes of history as we enter this chamber and make sure that that Ukraine has everything it needs in order to fight and win this war.
Sir Iain Duncan Smith.
Speaker, I congratulate the honourable gentleman for achieving this debate. I'm sad that it's gone to an hour and a half rather than 3 hours. It's a rather important debate, has to be said, and it gives time, I hope, for the Minister to answer some of these questions. The reality is, for us here, is that we are in a peculiar position as a government. I'm not blaming the specific government, because the previous government was also in the same position as well, which is, just as been said by the honourable gentleman opposite, we're trapping ourselves in the same arguments that are meant to release us to get after those who have done egregious harm to others by an illegal invasion of another territory. That's very clear. That is the reason why we should be permitted now at this stage, where necessary, to look at those frozen assets and to seize them. It's very simple. And I would argue to the government, because there isn't time to go through all the legal arguments, but there are very good reasons why, and I'm happy to write to him the details of this, why we would be able to act in this. First of all, it's always important, instead of claiming that international law prohibits us from doing these things, we do need to remember the basis of international law is pretty fluid, because it is hugely influenced by the politics of the day. Otherwise, we'd still be trapped in what happened in 1950, where it's not like that now. Things have moved on, and that is another particular point. The British government, I think, most of all, should lead on all of this, not use these as arguments against, but to lead to make those changes necessary as is possible. And the main point I want to make, though, is when we get into all of this idea of freezing assets and then sequestering those assets, there is a very good point at the end of all of this, which is, look, we are going to face, hopefully soon, an end to this war, the brutality and the executions and the murder and the ghastly damage that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine. And there have to be, ultimately, reparations on the country that invaded Ukraine, which is Russia. And the trouble is, we know very well that if we impose those, we know they will never stand by that, and they will never pay any reparations at all. Yeah. So the only hope we have is at least to get some way towards that, is to seize the state assets and those by the oligarchs, and to say that these could be held in payment of the reparations that are necessary and will be released in accordance with those reparations as paid under what the UN says at the end of that particular war. And that is one way of using them. by seizing them to say you will get these back, but you will only get them back when you have stood up and done what you have been told to do after this aggressive war. And there is no other reason why. I mean, if you look at it very carefully, it's already the case that we're now looking at taking the monies that are earned off the assets as they are at the moment in the banks, etc. And that set of assets, plus their income, cannot be separated. At the moment, we're talking of separating the income from the assets as though there is some fundamental difference between who owns what. The state that has the asset banked also owns, therefore, the money that is earned off it while it is banked. And therefore, we cannot just say, well, we might do one but not the other. If we want to seize what is earned, we should also recognise that allows us to seize the asset itself that is there in the bank earning that money. And so there is no reason why we should not pursue that as well. I say to the Minister, I'd be grateful if he would respond to this in due course. And there is no obligation or block on international law to doing any of this, I believe. These are arguments that are being held at the moment in various court cases. And by the way, we're not talking about seizing unilaterally by the UK assets. In Canada, as already been mentioned, and in the US, they've already passed legislation to give them the permission to seize those assets. The Anglosphere is beginning to come together on this one. There is foot-dragging, I think, in Germany and in France, and very much in Belgium, and we know the reason why. Belgium has such a huge amount of Russian assets sitting in it. They seem to be somewhat troubled by the idea of taking those assets over. But the point I would make is, surely now is the chance for this United Kingdom government, and I say this in a cross-party spirit completely, this United Kingdom government, my government, because that is so they are elected, to take the lead in arguing now for us to use these assets against future reparations that need to be paid to mend what has gone on so appallingly in Ukraine. And I urge the government to step up, take that lead, and give the rest of the developed world the chance to get that money into the places where it can do the most good.
Dr. Jeevun, Sandher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We agree across this House that we must show Putin we have the resolve and the resources to defeat him. Because if we don't, a great power war more terrible than we can imagine can come. A century ago, politicians on these benches failed, and what followed was the most destructive war in the history of humankind. To stop that horror being repeated, as this motion rightly identifies, depends upon us winning at war economics. War economics is simple. Whichever side can command greater resources and convert those into fighting forces will win. Winning a single battle means nothing if the other side can keep throwing in resources to win the next one. Amateurs, Madam Deputy Speaker, talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Winning at war economics means we must do three things. Firstly, limit Russia's earnings and output. Secondly, limit Russia's ability to convert its earnings into fighting force. And thirdly, gaining and converting those resources, our resources, into fighting forces. And seizing the 300 billion that we speak of today helps with a third of those only if we convert those resources into fighting forces. Firstly, to reduce Russia's output and earnings. Russia's earnings from oil are still far too high, $150 billion a year. Urals oil is trading at $67 above the price cap. Russia is circumventing that by padding out costs for its shadow fleet in attestation documents. Now, Maximilian Hess, the esteemed foreign policy expert, has shown we can strengthen our price cap by making London insurance for foreign ports dependent on properly attestation documents. And I am pleased, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Office for Financial Sanctions agreed to look at this when they came before the Treasury Select Committee. Secondly, we must stop Russia converting its output into munitions and materials. Too many of our Western components are finding their way onto Russian front lines. And thirdly, we must do more to convert the resources that we need into fighting forces. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is where our industrial defence strategy comes in. And that is what seizing the $300 billion can help with. As an economist, I should be clear and confirm to this House that seizing those assets would not damage our economy nor reduce financial stability. But on seizing those assets, we must be clear on the how and the why. On the how, we cannot seize these assets unilaterally. We only hold about 10% here, 2/3 are held in Europe. So we must convince our European allies to do as the Canadians and the Americans have committed to and also seize those assets. And on the why, those assets are only useful if we convert them into defence production. The bit-by-bit approach that has characterised support to Ukraine must end. Large, sustained increase is what is needed. Putin wants to rebuild a greater Russia, to swallow his neighbours whole. He will attempt to take more of Europe, and to defeat him means defeating our own complacency. The history of nations is a history of war. That history only changed when the calculation of peace was changed, through military force, through sacrosanct borders, and through democracy. If we do not show that we have the resolve and the resources to defeat Putin, we will make the same mistakes members made on these benches almost a century ago. One of our nation's greatest prime ministers stands outside this chamber, hands astride his hips, and he warned members in this chamber. He lamented the time wasted in not preparing. He spoke of the years the locusts had eaten, and he was ignored. Members on these benches were too complacent. Let us not be complacent. Members on these benches failed. Let us not fail. Members on these benches saw oceans of blood spilt by the youth of this nation. Let us not be the generation that sees oceans of blood wash over this continent once more. Let us be the generation that keeps the peace by showing Putin we have the resolve and resources to defeat him. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Chris Coghlan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to commend my honourable friend for Tunbridge Wells for securing this vital debate. There are many veterans in this chamber. 1 in 9 Liberal Democrat MPs have served in the armed forces. We know the price of freedom. Many of us have seen it written on the grave of a friend. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians paying that bitter price right now. And all of this will be in vain if we falter in our support. With the looming Trump administration, that risk is real. As the Honourable Member for Loughborough has said, if Ukraine fails, the consequences for our security are catastrophic. In the same way that our failure to show resolve on Syria perhaps encouraged Putin to attack Crimea, our failure to show resolve on Ukraine might encourage Putin to attack the Baltic states, test NATO's Article 5, and shatter the peace in Europe. This does not need to be our future. If the G7 sees the $300 billion in Russian assets, we have the opportunity not only to keep Ukraine in the fight, but to win. Now, many are worried that seizing the $300 billion in Russian assets could undermine the global financial system. I'm here to argue that that is not the case. As Lawrence Summers, the former US Treasury Secretary, and many others have pointed out, these fears are overblown, because when the assets were frozen in the first place, there were no observed consequences in financial markets. It has been made clear to financial markets that the assets of a sovereign aggressor are at risk when they are on deposit in the G7 country, as they should be. So it should already have been substantially priced in, the risk that these assets will be seized, reducing the possibility of capital flight from a negative surprise. In any case, where would this capital fly to if the G7 act together? The pound, dollar, euro and yen amount to almost 90% of the world's reserve currencies. To be clear, China is not an option because of capital controls. So there are no other viable reserve currencies for countries to deposit their reserves in. And as a former hedge fund manager, I spent years investing professionally in financial markets, and I can assure the House that investors will not be discouraged from investing in safe and attractive G7 currencies for two simple reasons: fear and greed. Now, today, the West spends $105 billion annually on Ukraine's defence, including $45 billion from the US. So the $300 billion in Russian assets could fund the lot for 3 years, or the US portion for 6 if Trump withdraws his support. And many think that Russia's resources are inexhaustible. Yet, according to RUSI, they're going to run out of artillery ammunition and armoured vehicles next year. They've already suffered 700,000 casualties. So Russia's capacity to wage war will fall dramatically in 1 year's time, but only if we can keep Ukraine in the fight. Yeah. And if Ukraine can end this war on terms that demonstrate that it is victorious, the consequences for our security are profound. The threat from Russia will be greatly diminished. China will think twice about challenging a liberal world order, and the narrative of the decline of the free world and the rising of dictatorships will be decisively set back. And then imagine then what the free world could achieve in the 21st century. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I urge the government to seize the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets to keep Ukraine in the fight. And I salute the Ukrainian soldiers who are laying down their lives, not only for their country's freedom, but our freedom too. Thank you.
Rachel Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member from Tunbridge Wells for securing this debate. I speak today as the constituency Member of Parliament for many of the assets we are discussing here today. It is easy to throw around the many billions of Russian-owned wealth across the country. It is for this reason that when referencing the luxurious wealth of Putin's cronies, all of my calculations today are going to be in the unit of Storm Shadow missiles, each of which cost £800,000. These are the weapons of war which we talk about when we discuss funding the conflict in Ukraine. In total, 28,375 Storm Shadows worth of Russian wealth is sanctioned, with profits from this wealth used to repay the extraordinary revenue acceleration funding the UK's support of Ukraine. To put this in perspective, the UK's total stock of Storm Shadows was estimated in 2023 to sit between 700 and 1,000. In Westminster alone, 537 Storm Shadows worth of property is owned by Russians accused of corruption or with links to the Kremlin, according to research by Transparency International. This stretches from property in Belgravia to St James and to St John's Wood. Indeed, the most valuable home in the UK, Hanover Lodge, was sold last year for 141 Storm Shadows by Andrei Goncharenko, a former Gazprom executive with ties to the Kremlin. A great deal of this property is owned by or connected to sanctioned individuals, including former Deputy Prime Ministers Igor Shuvalov and Vladimir Potanin. The existence of this property is not just an economic issue, its impact reaches into the very hearts of our communities. Our buildings and neighbourhoods are weakened when used for profit rather than purpose. A strong community is one where neighbours can be the ones who look after your kids when you have a job interview. But it's these communities which are undermined when we let towers of vacant investment properties propagate and when we turned a blind eye to foreign wealth emptying out British homes. Most recently, these communities have opened their arms to hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians fleeing from Putin's illegal invasion, and I'm a constituency member for a number of these refugees. And it's in thinking of them which gives us the overwhelming majority of us in this House resolve to use every tool at our disposal, which brings us to today's topic, the seizure of sanctioned assets. The significance of this, as we've heard earlier, and the precedent which it would set should not escape us as legislators. The first ever permanent seizure of frozen assets occurred only last year, when the National Crime Agency confiscated the assets of Peter Arvin for suspected evasion of sanctions. And to set out an intentional policy of doing this would be a bold step, and one which doubtless would lead to legal challenge. However, it must be worth us considering every option available for sanctioned assets, particularly when there is a clear argument that it would be justified to use them in supporting the Ukrainian people. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is in complete contravention of international law and violates the sovereignty and self-determination of the Ukrainian people. Further to this, it has enabled a string of other war crimes, as has been confirmed by the UN's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, including indiscriminate attacks, violations of personal integrity, including executions, torture and ill treatment, and sexual and gender-based violence. As was made clear during the application of the original sanctions, the sanctioned individuals are playing a direct part in this war. This goes from propagandists spreading disinformation about the conflict to garner public support domestically and across the globe, to industrialists manufacturing the chemicals used in Russian weapons, to members of military and security personnel directly contributing to the invasion. When the war in Ukraine is over, questions will remain about what we do with the 28,000 storm shadows of sanctioned wealth belonging to those who funded, championed, and even fought in Putin's illegal invasion. We must take this opportunity to consider what sort of country we want to be when it comes to this dirty money, and to ensure we do not let our economy be complicit in the forces which fund evil across the world.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And of course, these debates about what's happening, the horrors that are happening in Ukraine at the moment, are always, I think, very important debates and very difficult debates to speak in. And I very much appreciated listening to some of the harrowing stories to remind myself of just what the Ukrainians are experiencing for their own country, for themselves, but also for all of us in terms of pushing back from Putin's war machine. And I think it's certainly one of, I think, the things I'm most proud of our country is the leadership that we showed over the past few years in the international response for the support for the Ukrainians to stand up against Putin. And a key part of that was to bring together the international community to multilaterally, not unilaterally, support the Ukrainians in their plight and their efforts. Early on in this conflict, we saw the weaponisation of oil and gas prices. We saw hybrid warfare. We continue to see hybrid warfare. This has been going on for some time. And I very much supported, on any stage, the full fat embargo of oil and gas against Russia. Indeed, this House strongly supported the sanctions going forwards, and they've been a very important part of what we can do to support the Ukrainians. But as tempting as this motion is, and it's a very tempting motion when you read it, I have to say I do have, like members have expressed across both sides of this House, some cautions and concern and reservations about it and going forwards. And I think it's important to consider the impact on the international financial order and the rule of law. And this is what differentiates us from Putin and from the Russian state, is that we do consider this and we do debate this. We have this place where we can consider the rule-based order. Putin thinks this makes us weak. He is wrong. This makes us strong. And this is what we stand for and what we believe in. And so I would say this, is that if this is to be done, we are to look at seizing assets. There's two considerations that I think are very important. One is that it focuses on state assets.
as opposed to companies and individuals, as there is no judicial process at the moment for individuals or companies who've had their assets frozen. If it goes to seizing, it's a much bigger step. I know members have mentioned individuals and companies as well as state, but I think the focus has to be specifically on Russian state assets. I think the legal framework is stronger around that. Secondly, as with how we led from the beginning in the conflict, this has to be a multinational approach. This has to be linked through with the G7, with our partners in Europe. This has to be done together in unison. And we've got the history of doing it. I would say to the Minister, this is something, I'm very proud of how we've done. If we're going to do it, we've got to do it multilaterally. And also, we need to look at the assets being used for military use, as opposed to just general economic support. My understanding is that the interest money that's now been freed up has been restricted from being used for military interventions. So this is something that needs to be considered as well as part of the process. Finally, just in my concluding remarks, I say we can't, though, we also need to make sure that our sanctions are effective as they are currently in place. And I've mentioned just a few weeks, just before Christmas, the oil and gas embargo, particularly crude oil derivatives, and my concern is that these could be finding their way, despite the embargo, into the UK economy. I'm very grateful for the Minister responding to me on some of my specific questions on that, but I do hope he would look very carefully about the effectiveness of the rules of origin, the proofs of origin, but also particularly when it comes to petrochemical derivatives, things like plastics and other products which can be manufactured through the use of Russian oil and gas, and how we can make sure that in our economy, our oil and gas embargo of Russia is as effective as is possible before we even start to look at these next measures that we can take going forwards. Thank you.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I also thank the Honourable Member for Tunbridge Wells for securing this important debate today. This issue matters deeply to my constituents in Kensington and Bayswater too. We are home to a thriving Ukrainian community and a hub of Ukrainian institutions, from the embassy and the consulate to the social club and school. But in Kensington, we are also regrettably at the epicentre of Britain's historical addiction to corrupt kleptocrat wealth in close competition with my honourable friend from the cities of London and Westminster. In the wake of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, I co-founded the Kensington Against Dirty Money campaign with local community campaigners to expose the vast sums of illicit capital hidden in luxury property in our community. That dirty money, as been said, undermines democracy both at home and abroad, and for too long kleptocrats have been able to sidestep the rules and hoard illicit wealth through opaque corporate structures. I will.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for securing the debate. I wonder if the honourable member would agree with me that if the West fails to act decisively in seizing Russian assets, then it simply signals to authoritarian regimes worldwide that aggression and the violation of international law comes with little consequence, and this will destabilise the global order, and it really increase the likelihood of future conflicts.
Thank the honourable member for her intervention, and I think she's absolutely right. There are things we can do to be the trailblazer as the UK, things we need to do in partnership with our international partners, and I'll come on in a second to how I think we can do more on the assets specifically. But I also did want to take the opportunity to welcome the Foreign Secretary and the Minister's personal and relentless campaign on sanctions, including the recent action on the shadow fleet. But for those measures to be fully effective, we must ensure that sanctions cannot be evaded, and there are still some loopholes that need to be closed. My honourable friend, the Minister, will know that I've been following closely the progress of our overseas territories and Crown dependencies to finally follow the will of Parliament and establish public registers of company ownership, allowing us to follow the money and detect where sanctions evasion may be taking place in places like the British Virgin Islands. It also means that we need to consider incorporating trust-owned property into our register of overseas entities, ensuring that trusts cannot be used to conceal property that could be subject to sanctions. As we've said, our residents deserve better than living in these communities, hollowed out by wealth built on corruption and suffering, while my constituents are at the sharp end of London's housing crisis. And in my honourable friend for Chelsea and Fulham's next-door constituency, there is the case of Chelsea Football Club. Over 2 years ago, Roman Abramovich was forced to sell the club with approximately £2.5 billion pledged to humanitarian programmes for victims of the war. Yet not a single penny of that money has been spent. Those Chelsea funds amount to 5 times the UK's total humanitarian assistance to Ukraine since 2022 and remain stuck in an escrow account. That is a travesty when releasing those funds wouldn't cost the British taxpayer a penny, but would save countless lives at a time when 15 million people require urgent assistance in eastern Ukraine alone, and humanitarian agencies face a shortfall of £1.3 billion. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also welcome the UK's leadership within the G7 on securing the additional $50 billion of support to Ukraine using the profits from the holdings of immobilised Russian sovereign assets, with over £2 billion coming from the UK's share. So we've led on sanctions, we've led on freezing assets, and we've led on mobilising the interest on assets. And now I believe it is time for the UK to lead a coalition of willing nations to take decisive action to seize those sovereign assets in full.
Will you give way?
I will give way.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. I would invite the honourable member to recognise that there is international precedent for the seizure of Russian assets. Back in 1990, following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the US, UK and France transferred Iraqi assets to Kuwait to directly correspond with reparations to Kuwait. Does the honourable member agree that this should be the case with Russian assets?
Honourable member for his intervention, and I agree. I think the moral and legal rationale for seizing these assets is clear. The total cost of damage of Russia's destruction of Ukraine has already far exceeded the total frozen state assets, and it is inconceivable that Russia will ever pay for the irreparable harm it has caused Ukraine. And seizing these assets would not only increase Ukraine's capacity to resist further destruction, but it would help its leaders rebuild the country. It will be a down payment on the reparations that Russia will almost certainly be legally liable for, and make them face the full consequences of their actions now. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain's leadership on Ukraine has been exemplary. It has been cross-party, from military support to Homes for Ukraine and sanctions, but there is always more to do. So I ask the Minister if he could address some of these points on how we can make our sanctions more effective by tackling evasion, close the loopholes in our property register, release the Chelsea funds, and mobilise this international coalition to seize Russian state assets and support our friends on the front line in Ukraine right now.
Brings us to the front bench contributions. James MacCleary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would like to start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Tunbridge Wells, for securing this really valuable and important debate. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine is not just an assault on one nation, but a direct challenge to the shared values that unite Europe: democracy, sovereignty and the rule of law. Europe must respond with strength and unity, and the UK has a unique role to play in leading that charge. Russia's malign influence extends far beyond Ukraine. From interference in democratic elections across Europe to spreading disinformation, the Kremlin has shown its commitment to undermining democratic values that bind our continent. This is not just Ukraine's fight, it is a fight for the integrity of all of our democracies. Our defence sector is amongst the largest in Europe, and our international influence remains significant. When I meet with European colleagues, one message is clear: they want the UK to lead. This is a moment for the UK to step up and demonstrate the leadership that has long defined our place in Europe, even, for now, outside the European Union. Seizing frozen Russian assets and repurposing them is one of the most effective ways to support Ukraine. These funds are not just financial resources, they are symbols of aggression that must now become instruments of justice. Putin's grasp on power depends on corruption and control. By seizing and repurposing these assets, we can weaken his grip. Our allies have already shown the way. Canada amended its Special Economic Measures Act to allow the seizure of Russian assets for grave breaches of international peace, and the United States passed the Repo Act to transfer Russian sovereign assets directly to Ukraine. These steps provide clear and workable models for the UK and Europe to adopt.
Will the member give way?
Certainly.
I'd like to thank the member. I agree with him on the legal precedent, and it would be very interesting to hear the Minister about that. We've already heard about the Iraq precedent from previously as well. The legal precedent is there. But crucially, does the member agree with me that Russia has stepped outside the international norm? To protect the international rules-based system, we must show that there are consequences for this kind of action, and therefore it's actually imperative on us to take action to show that that matters.
Yeah. I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and much as my honourable friend said earlier, it's like I gave you a copy of my speech because I was about to come on to that. Stopping the Russian assault on Ukraine is part of a wider struggle for the future of democracy and liberty, both in Europe and around the world. Russian ruler Vladimir Putin has made this war an existential one, staking the future of his regime on it. But be in no doubt that current and wannabe dictators are watching closely how European powers respond to Russia's challenge. Any wavering in our support for Ukraine could easily be interpreted as a green light to others to launch grabs for coveted territory. In short, the basis of the liberal world order is at stake, and Britain has a duty to protect that order that we did so much to create. With the looming return of Donald Trump to the White House, the stakes for Europe could not be higher. The future of US support for Ukraine is uncertain, and Europe must be prepared to step up. This wake-up call for the UK, we must lead within Europe and ensure that brave Ukrainians receive robust support they need from us. Beyond repurposing assets, we must also address the systemic failures that have allowed dirty money to flood into our economy. The UK has long been a destination of choice for Russian wealth, much of it funneled through loopholes in economic crime legislation. It's time to properly resource the National Crime Agency, close these loopholes and make it clear that kleptocrats are no longer welcome. Yeah. Members here who are students of Russian and East European history like myself will be familiar with the word Holodomor. There's been lots of references to history and the lessons we should take from it. For those of you who aren't familiar, we would simply call it the Ukrainian famine. In 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians, uncounted millions, starved to death as a direct result of policies prosecuted by another dictator in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin. And I genuinely hope that people in this chamber in the future will not look back on us and say that we could have done more to stop another great crime against the Ukrainian people. Yeah. The Liberal Democrats have been clear. This is about more than military aid. It is about holding Russia accountable and strengthening Ukraine's defences. Ukraine's fight is our fight. By taking decisive action now, the UK can reaffirm that aggression will never be rewarded, that Europe will always stand firm in defence of freedom, and that Britain remains at the heart of the continent's security and values.
Shadow Minister Gareth Davies.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. I'd like to start by congratulating the honourable member for securing this debate, and actually congratulate him on giving what I thought was an incredibly moving speech, telling the story of Sasha and, of course, 19,000 children. It is absolutely heartbreaking what is happening in Ukraine, and he is right to raise those concerns with the House today. Now, just as we start every new year, many people have entered 2025 last week with hope, optimism, and with determination that this year will be better than the last. It's therefore right that the first debate we have this year is about our united resolve to ensure that Ukraine can continue to oppose Russian aggression, and that we debate ways in which we in this country can continue to support our friend and ally in this task. And we've heard a number of excellent speeches from across the House, which have been both informed and incredibly moving, as I've said. For 1,047 days now, Ukrainian men, women and children have been suffering the consequences of the most recent stage of a war they did not ask for, a war they did not start, and one that continues to claim the lives of so many of their friends, family and fellow countrymen. We, on this side of the House, are proud of our record of support when it comes to the people of Ukraine. In government, we provided over £12 billion in military, humanitarian and economic support Because of this, the United Kingdom has rightly taken its place as a global leader in defending Ukraine. The UK was a first mover on vital aid, from helmets and body armour to, yes, Storm Shadow missiles and Challenger 2 battle tanks. We created safer routes for those fleeing the conflict with the Ukrainian Family Scheme and the Homes for Ukraine scheme, which many members in this House participated in. We established Operation Interflex, which has now trained over 50,000 Ukrainian recruits on British soil since the illegal invasion in 2022. And we imposed the largest and most severe set of sanctions that Russia has ever seen, with 2,000 individuals, companies and groups sanctioned. This ensures that we're not just targeting the sectors of strategic significance to the Russian government, but that those in and around the Kremlin have been left with nowhere to hide, no matter where they are based. And just as President Putin has so far sacrificed the lives of hundreds of thousands of his own countrymen on the altar of his own personal imperial ambitions, he seems determined too to destroy the future prosperity of the Russian people. And just as my right honourable friend for South West Wiltshire was saying, Putin must be made to pay for his actions. And I know a number of members have made this clear. Ukraine must continue to be supported in their fight against Putin's war machine. And therefore, we welcome that this government is continuing much of the vital work that we started to strengthen the Ukrainian response. But we know that British support for Ukraine is underpinned by our willingness and that of our NATO allies to also invest in our own defence. That's why I hope the government will keep their pre-election pledge to increase defence spending in this country to 2.5% of GDP. Now, as I've said already, like many times before, I'm pleased that there is such a clear consensus of support for Ukraine in this House, on military support, on humanitarian aid, or indeed on sanctions, where government takes responsible and sensible steps to further this. We, as the official opposition, will of course support them. The last Conservative government was one of the most vocal proponents of repurposing frozen Russian assets, and we drove our G7 and European allies to coalesce around the most ambitious solution. And the announcement by the Treasury on the 22nd of October that the UK would contribute £2.26 billion to the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans to Ukraine scheme does represent progress on that journey, and we very much welcome that. But we should never stop looking for innovative ways that can legally mobilise frozen sovereign assets. So it would be good to hear from the Minister what further steps the government is exploring on that. And when debating the issue of frozen Russian assets, I think it'd be helpful for the House to be provided with the most up-to-date information. So first, can the Minister update the House on the total value today of Russian assets frozen by the G7, and on the total assets frozen by UK jurisdictions? Secondly, can the Minister give some indication of the allocation of frozen assets by type? There's been some discussion of that today, but I think it would be very helpful if the government could give an indication of that breakdown for colleagues today. Now, of course, today's debate is focused on the seizure of frozen Russian assets to assist Ukraine. The Minister will be well aware, and this has been discussed at length today, of the various legal considerations, both internationally and domestically, on the specific subject of seizure. Given recent comments by the EU's chief diplomat, I look forward to the Minister clarifying exactly what the government's position is right now, and to update the House on the latest discussions, as many have called for today, that the government has had with our G7 partners and with other allies on the specific subject of seizure. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, we should never allow ourselves to forget what this is ultimately all about. While many of us return to this place after what I hope was a very restful and even perhaps indulgent Christmas break, I'll remind the House that people of Ukraine faced a very different Christmas Nowhere was this better illustrated than on Christmas Day, as Ukrainians gathered together at St. Michael's Cathedral in Kyiv, praying for peace and for victory in 2025. Their prayers cruelly interrupted by the piercing sound of air raid sirens. Be in no doubt that the fight continues, not just for those on the front line, but for all those who want their country to be free again.
Will the Shadow Minister give way?
Yeah.
I'm grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way, and I can hear in his speech that he's coming to a conclusion. The Shadow Minister is himself a former investment banker, and so I'm very curious to know what is the position of His Majesty's opposition on the seizure of frozen Russian assets?
Very much welcome the intervention. I think, look, in terms of our position in government and our position in opposition, is that we should do whatever it takes to hold Russia to account, to ensure that Russia pays, and that we support Ukraine. And I've set out a number of ways, financial and other, that we did that in government. In government and in opposition, we clearly have concerns about legal obstacles that may or may not exist, and that is right that we debate that today. But also, yes, the impact on markets and sentiment and investor confidence. And I think it's not as simple as perhaps some are suggesting. There are a number of factors, but we should leave the option open, and we should continue to explore all options when it comes to, as I say, supporting Ukraine and holding Russia to account and ensuring that they pay. I'll take one more.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I think really the key point is that was made by my honourable friend for Runnymede and Weybridge about the distinction between the private assets, even such tainted ones as are held by oligarchs, and state assets. And the mover of this motion will correct me if I'm wrong, but the $300 billion worth of assets that are referred to in the motion are actually state assets, and no fewer than 11 professors and other legal experts in a publication by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in May last year were unanimous in saying that when it comes to state assets, there is no legal obstacle for a seizure by a third-party state like ourselves.
Well, I welcome the intervention by my right honourable friend, who is extremely diligent in his assessment on such matters, and I'll allow the Minister, who is actually in government, to provide the government's legal assessment of what may or may not be possible. But I've set out the concerns that we have, which we're very happy to continue to debate and discuss, as I've said. But it is right that across the House, we continue in our support for Ukraine. It's right that we continue to discuss all the ways in which we can support them, and if there is a way, we should look at it. Thank you.
Minister Doughty.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I first thank the Honourable Member for Tunbridge Wells and indeed other colleagues across the House for tabling this important debate today. And very much, he made a very powerful speech starting out with the horrific story of Sasha, and it made me think not only of the similar stories that I've heard directly, but also of the work done in communities around the UK in maintaining Ukrainian culture and heritage, the very culture and heritage and language which Putin is trying to erase from the lives of those children. I visited the centre in my own constituency in Cardiff just a few weeks before Christmas, and I'm very, very grateful to all the honourable and right honourable members for their contributions today and their challenge. They've made some very, very important points. They can be assured that I've heard them all very carefully, and I think it's really important to emphasise again, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've seen absolute unity in this House in our desire to support Ukraine, support them in their fight, and also that Russia must pay. And those are the two key messages for me coming out of this debate, because as all of us in this chamber know well, Russia's assault on Ukraine is an unprovoked, premeditated and barbaric attack against a sovereign democratic state. And as the honourable gentleman speaking for the opposition said, those Christmas Day attacks very much reinforced the shocking and barbaric nature of what Russia is doing. And the UK and our international partners stand united. We cannot let aggressors like Putin succeed. And I'm going to attempt to respond to many of the points that have been made today. They've all been very important. I want to start, though, by underlining the magnitude of the UK's response to Putin's invasion. We have sanctioned more than 2,100 individuals and entities. We've frozen over 22 billion worth of private assets under the Russia sanctions regime. The Honourable Gentleman asked for some allocation by type. I'll certainly try to write to him with some further detail on that. And alongside G7 partners, we have immobilised Russian state assets in our jurisdiction too. We have led international shipping sanctions that have disrupted the Russian shadow fleet, leaving oil tankers idling across the globe, unable to continue their trade. We've ramped up action since July to include a further 89 tankers, barring them from our ports and denying them access to maritime services. We've also sanctioned 9 vessels involved in the shipping of LNG from Russia, which has contributed to Russia's largest producer suspending production. And that is alongside measures targeting firms supplying Russia's military-industrial complex, including Chinese companies sending components for drones. We've sanctioned cyber criminals and mercenaries seeking to destabilise African countries, not to mention Russian troops for the appalling use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. And these carefully constructed and wide-ranging packages are having a significant impact on Putin's ability to finance his war, eroding Russian oil revenues and supporting Ukraine on the battlefield. The fact is, and there was a lot of talk about war economics by one of my honourable friends, Madam Deputy Speaker, but now Russia is paying many more times for components, often of poorer quality and in much lower quantities than it needs. And by disrupting the Russian oil industry, we're putting further pressure on the Kremlin. And that has all contributed to a Russian economy which is in trouble. Inflation at close to 10%, interest rates at 21%, the ruble in decline. And Putin, Madam Deputy Speaker, has told his population not to panic. But disagreements between officials and industrialists are increasingly vocal, and that should serve as a reminder not only to Putin but also the wider world that there is a high price to pay for assaulting the democracy, sovereignty and territorial integrity of another nation. There have been many questions rightly raised about enforcement. I have been absolutely clear, as the Foreign Secretary has, since coming into office, that we must have the necessary powers and tools to implement and enforce our sanctions regimes effectively. Strengthening the system is a top priority for this government, and with the support of ministerial colleagues, I've launched a cross-government review to examine how we can make it easier for businesses to comply with sanctions, but also bringing the full force of law to bear on those who do not. And we're working across government departments on that. We've introduced new powers to the Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation, for the Department of Transport, and indeed in September last year the Financial Conduct Authority fined Starling Bank almost 29 million in relation to its financial sanctions controls and screening. And last month the National Crime Agency, Madam Deputy Speaker, disrupted multi-billion-dollar Russian money laundering networks with links to drugs, ransomware and espionage, resulting in 84 arrests. And they also seized more than £20 million in cash and cryptocurrency. The Foreign Secretary has been rightly been referenced by honourable friends, has launched an important campaign on tackling illicit finance and kleptocracy, including those who enable those. And we've made it very clear that those seeking to evade our sanctions, we will not hesitate to do what is necessary to clamp down on them. We want to ensure that Ukraine emerges from this war with a modernised and inclusive economy, resilient to Russian threats, and that's as important as providing them the crucial military support that they need. So we're going to continue to work across a range of donor platforms, leveraging private investments, the work that was undertaken at the Ukraine Recovery Conference, the work of UK Export Finance, and indeed of British international investment too. And we have now committed £12.8 billion in military, humanitarian and economic support to Ukraine. We've often been the first mover, as being rightly referenced, when it comes to vital lethal assistance, whether it's Storm Shadow missiles or Challenger 2 tanks. And of course, the NLAWs at the start of this war. We've also recommitted to £3 billion a year for as long as it takes, and signed a long-term bilateral security cooperation, the first of 25 countries to do so. And as been rightly referenced, the Chancellor has further announced that we will provide that £2.26 billion additional support to Ukraine as part of the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans to Ukraine scheme. And I want to thank members from across the House in ensuring the speedy passage of the legislation to put that in place. And it passed that third reading unanimously. And crucially, these funds will be repaid not by Ukraine, but by the extraordinary profits made on sanctioned Russian state assets held in the European Union. Now, the fundamental questions that were being asked today, Madam Deputy Speaker, around what more we can do to use Russian assets for the benefit of Ukraine are at the heart of the debate. And the government and our G7 partners have repeatedly affirmed our position. Russia's obligations under international law are clear. They must pay for the damage they have caused to Ukraine. And the ERA loan and our contribution ensure that Ukraine can now receive financial support it needs now. It was right to focus on that and getting that out the door. We need to support them now and urgently, and it uses the profits generated on sanctioned Russian sovereign assets to do so. But I also want to reassure colleagues across the House who have rightly asked a lot of searching and challenging questions today that we are committed to considering all possible lawful avenues by which Russia is made to meet its obligation to pay for the damage it's causing Ukraine, and we continue to work with allies to this end. And I will give way, but let me just finish. And I want to confirm that I spoke to foreign ministers from across Europe on this and other crucial aspects of our support for Ukraine just before the House rose in December, and we will continue to update Parliament, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the progress of this work. However, I hope honourable members will understand that it would be not appropriate to provide a running commentary on the discussions, as allies have committed to keeping these private, including the specific sums that are currently frozen that are Russian sovereign assets. But I'll happily give way.
I'm very grateful to the Minister and absolutely accept what he says. Does he appreciate that with the possibility of President Trump withdrawing some, if not all, American aid to Ukraine, the substitution of a substantial volume of financial support will become absolutely essential? And that's one reason behind our concern about the assets possibly being seized.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we're all concerned to get Ukraine the support they need and as quickly as possible. I think it's wrong to speculate on what any future administration might choose to do. Let's remember that the package that came through from the United States was with strong bipartisan support, and of course much of the support to Ukraine even before the 22 invasion came from the first Trump administration. So let's be clear that there is support there, and there is united support across the Atlantic on support for Ukraine. I will give way to the Honourable General.
On that basis, by the way, President Trump has already said he will continue with the payments and with the support. Can I just ask a simple question? We know now from the recent finance bill that just passed by the House that using the asset profits to help support Ukraine up to 50 billion, they've also broken an existing previous legal commitment, which you could not do that before without prior legislation. And the reality is that means the assets themselves have never been separated from the profits. So I simply say to the Minister, doesn't have to answer the question now, we need to go back to the Foreign Office and remind them that they've left the assets now available for seizure.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his comments. I hope he does write to me with the letter that he promised in the course of the debate. I will read it with great interest. He's extremely well informed of these matters, and he knows I've taken a keen interest in them over some time. As I said, we will consider all lawful measures in which we can possibly do to ensure that Ukraine gets the support that it needs, and I'll listen closely to his advice and indeed the advice of many others on this. And of course, you wouldn't expect me to comment on any legal advice or technical advice that's under consideration. But I did. And conscious of the time and the need to get on to the next debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, I did genuinely want to thank all the honourable and right honourable members today. There were hugely important points made. It's clear that there's unity in this House that we all want to get Ukraine the support that they need and to get that there as quickly as possible. I'm convinced that we're doing everything we can on both sides of those equations. In that war economics point made by my honourable friend, it's about choking off the ability for Russia to fund its war machine, but also getting Ukraine the support it needs. We will continue to do that. Our support is ironclad. We've made that clear to President Zelensky. I was with Foreign Minister Sabir a number of times before Christmas, and he is absolutely clear that the UK support is critical, that it must continue, and we're glad to give him that confirmation of our resolute support.
Mike Martin to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in light of my overrunning speech earlier, I won't take up the full 2 minutes that's been allocated to me, and I can give you some time back in a congested parliamentary timetable. I would just like to focus on two things. One is unity, and we've demonstrated that unity here tonight across the House. This is not about political party. This is about the moral and strategic interests of our country and our allies. And the other point is about leadership. We have led throughout on this conflict, and this is the next stage of that leadership. Thank you.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. which will enable the front benches to swap over. Could those who are leaving the chamber do so as swiftly and quietly as possible?